movement, Egypt's most organized and largest opposition force. The protest soon became a revolt. That Mubarak and his regime step down immediately became the immediate demand. Al-Baradei, the atomic energy official that has been seen to favor Iran, is being put forward by the revolutionaries to lead the transitional government. Mubarak sent his son and heir apparent out of the country, announced that neither he nor Gamal would stand for election in September, and appointed General Omar Suleiman as vice president. This latter was less of reform and more seen as a signal that he was determined to fill out his term. The U.S. was taken off guard. Egypt's government has, since the Camp David peace accord with Israel, been one of the largest aid recipients of the United States, averaging about $1.3 billion in military aid annually. Secretary Clinton had recently declared the regime to be stable. U.S. policy has fluctuated over the past few weeks over whether President Mubarak should lead the transition or go now. It is beginning to sink in that elections now may well equal an Islamic fundamentalist regime in the Arab world's most populous country. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded in Egypt in 1928, is capable, even likely, to win power in any free election. After all, the mosques have been the only place open for political organization during all these years of repression. The current announcement from the Obama administration emphasizes the importance of an orderly transition. Meanwhile, as if to underscore the risk to American interests, Iran has applauded the revolt, calling it an Islamic awakening. Hezbollah has as well. The Organization of Islamic Conference has, by contrast, been silent, appealing only to avoid violence. Saudi King Abdullah has warned of chaos and divisiveness in his statements. I visited Saudi Arabia last week and observed firsthand that there is little enthusiasm among the royals for an al-Baradei Muslim Brotherhood government in which Iran might wield the most influence. Some analysts in the United States, both conservative and liberal, have also advocated for an immediate end to military aid to Egypt, arguing that the Muslim Brotherhood will not get the votes to prevail in parliament, or that it is really a moderate force, not a fundamentalist one, or even conceding that it is fundamentalist but will moderate once in power. To help us analyze from different perspectives the prospects for a liberal democracy in Egypt, we have 4 expert presenters on our panel today. I'm delighted to introduce them. Samuel Tadros, who will be our first speaker, is finishing his master's at Georgetown University. He is a senior partner in the Egyptian Union of Liberal Youth. Mr. Tadros has previously worked as a consultant at the Hudson Institute on moderate Islamist thinkers in Egypt and interned at the American Enterprise Institute, where he analyzed the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Most recently, he has worked for the Heritage Foundation on an article on religious freedom in Egypt. He has received his BA from the American University in Cairo. Our next speaker will be Lee Smith, who is a visiting fellow at Hudson Institute and a senior editor at the Weekly Standard. His critically acclaimed 2010 book, The Strong Horse, Power Politics and the Clash of Arab Civilizations, has just been released in paperback by Anchor Books. Next will be Paul Marshall, who is my colleague and a senior fellow at the Center for Religious Freedom at Hudson. His global survey, Religious Freedom in the World, was published in 2008, and his book on religion and journalism, Blind Spot: Why Journalists Don't Get the News Because They Don't Get Religion, was published by Oxford University Press in 2009. He is the author and editor of 20 other books on religion and politics, and he and I have co-authored Silenced, a forthcoming book on the growing effects of blasphemy and apostasy laws in the Muslim world and the West, which will be published by Oxford in November. Our final speaker today is Doug Feith, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for National Security Strategies at the Hudson Institute. He is the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, War and Decision, Inside the Pentagon at the Dawn of the War on Terrorism. As Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from July 2001 until August 2005, Mr. Feith helped devise the U.S. government strategy for the war on terrorism and contributed to policy making for the Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns. In the Reagan administration, Mr. Feith worked as a Middle East specialist for the National Security Council and then served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Negotiations Policy. And before we begin, I'd like to ask you to all turn off your cell phones. The presenters will give short talks, and then we will turn to question and answers. Thank you. Okay.
Let me begin speaking today with a very short story from the first day of demonstrations in Cairo. A friend of mine goes to the first demonstration on Tuesday, the 25th, the day that started what is now claimed to be the Egyptian Revolution. There he finds an old acquaintance of ours, a man who calls himself a liberal democratic activist, very well educated, member of the Egyptian opposition. He finds him there screaming with his loud voice, "What a disgrace, what a disgrace, £6 are worth $1. My friend is a bit bewildered. What is so disgraceful about such a thing? Asking him, he gets the reply, "This is an insult to Egypt's honor. If Egypt was a great country, the Egyptian pound will be worth $6 and not the reverse." But my friend answers, actually a weak currency might be sometimes good for exports. Actually, it's very hard for the government to maintain overvalued exchange rate. The activist looks at my friend with bewilderment. It's not that the words were not understood. They were spoken in very clear Arabic. It's that the ideas behind those words were completely alien to him. He had not heard about those concepts before. Looking at my friend for a minute, he then looks at him and tells him, "Shout behind me. What a disgrace, what a disgrace." As Egypt has turned from what Secretary Clinton has described as a very stable country into a country of turmoil, people are glued to their TV screens, looking at the events with a sense of awe and admiration. And rightly so. Young men are seen demonstrating in the streets, bringing down a machine of security that has oppressed them for more than 30 years in a mere 4 hours. The prevailing narrative has been one of democracy. Young men are fighting for their democracy, and we should stand with them. Now, what those young men understand by the word democracy is, however, not exactly what those observers might mean. Commentators on CNN have mentioned that everyone they meet in the streets of Cairo seems to be in love with America and Israel. A bit absurd, probably. Probably they were interviewing people in the streets of Tel Aviv and not Cairo. But the prevailing narrative that those young men that support democracy, that want freedom, that has been the prevailing narrative. Now, to look at the prospects of how what is happening today in Egypt, this Egyptian revolution, will turn into a liberal democracy, one needs to look at the seriousness of how that would be made. To build a liberal democracy, the question is not whether people want it or not. There are other questions involved. Whether there are institutions in the country that can build a liberal democracy. Whether there is a rule of law in the country or not. Whether there is an independent judiciary that is able. I will touch upon a couple of those points. First is the issue of the liberal parties in the country. There are 3 main parties that are described as liberal and democratic. Their sense of the word, however, is quite different from that Westerners might have of the word. One of the leading liberal parties had a vice president who could write an article stating very clearly with the title, "Are Jews human beings or not?" The answer is no, they're locusts that should be exterminated. That's a leading liberal party. It calls itself liberal. Its ideas are hardly what we understand as by the word liberal. Another party stands against any selling of state property. the state properties, the state mechanism, the control of the state of the economy, they want to maintain it. How this fits with any understanding of the word is up to people to decide. The judiciary, yes, there is a strong independent judiciary in Egypt. There is a sense of the judiciary has fought the regime since 2005, trying to maintain that independence. But that same judiciary voted with over 92% in their judges club to exclude women judges, a decision that the Egyptian government was pushing. Are they independent? Yes. Do they have the values that we understand by the word liberal and democratic? Hardly. Whether there is a sense of civic education or culture that people can build on the ideas of a democratic society, whether the Egyptian educational system and the media provides any of those ideas that are needed to build a healthy political discourse that allow people to discuss different ideas and alternatives, that all lacks in society. So before people get so much excited about the idea of democracy being built, caution should be there. The institutions that are building this democracy need to be looked at. Democracy is not just about people being excited about it. There are other things involved. So if it is not democracy that is happening in Egypt, what is happening? In my view, what is happening is that the Egyptian army is taking power. The Egyptian army, which has always been the Egyptian regime, had recently been threatened greatly by Gamal Mubarak, the president's son. The army never liked Gamal Mubarak. The reasons are, outside of the fact that he didn't serve in the army, are very institutional reasons. Gamal's attempt to build a real party out of the loose organization that is the ruling party threatened the army in the sense that suddenly the road to achievement, the road to grow in society was no longer a military uniform, but was a party ID. The other sense in which Gamal Mubarak was threatening the army was the sense of economics. The Egyptian army's control of the Egyptian economy is immense. Estimates put the size of the Egyptian army's control of the economy at 40% of the economy. Gamal Mubarak's neoliberal team that had been trained by the World Bank were creating policies that were threatening the army's control of the economy. Looking at what was happening, the army found its golden opportunity. The army was able to put its narrative again to President Mubarak. The army's argument was that those policies were hurting the regime, that the army needs to be in control again to cool things down. In a sense, this is what's happening in Egypt. The young men are fighting in the streets, yes, but the real decisions are being fought inside the regime, where the army has been able to step by step exclude its competitors inside the regime. Where does this leave us at the end? Unfortunately, it leaves us with a very bad prediction, in a sense. We have in Egyptian history 2 incidents before where something similar had happened. In 1919, a generation revolted against British occupation. That generation thought it had achieved all its dreams, only to meet reality a couple of years later and discover that actually nothing has changed for them. The results were, to say the least, very problematic. This generation is the generation that formed the Muslim Brotherhood 9 years after the 1919 revolution. It was the generation that joined fascist organizations in Egypt in the 30s. The same incident, the same sense of high expectations and very low achievements leading to great disappointments happened after the narrative of a great victory in 1973. Never tried to tell any Egyptian that Egypt actually didn't win in 1973. But this sense of we achieved everything, and then this discovery that things weren't actually getting better. This reaction led to what we have seen in the growth of the violent radical Islamist organizations. What will happen in the future when this sense of nothing has actually changed in Egypt? That the opposition parties will each have a nice deal with the regime, will each get 20 seats in parliament, will each get better favors from the regime, where the regime will give, yes, some concessions, but will maintain power. What will happen to those young men in the streets? What will happen when they discover that all they had worked for actually resulted in nothing for them? That, I think, is a question that not only Egypt, but the world will have to deal with for some time in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. That was terrific, and thank you very much to Nina and the rest of Hudson for inviting me along here. Being on such a distinguished panel. I wanted to start off by saying I essentially agree with Samuel's interpretation. I think that one of the, I think perhaps the most cynical way to read what's happened over the last 2 weeks, and yet perhaps the most accurate, is that essentially what we've seen is a preemptive military coup. I think that the military didn't plan this, but I think the military saw what was happening on the streets and understood that they could take advantage of what was happening on the streets. To wit, as Sam explained quite clearly, the military does not like Gamal Mubarak, and the military was not happy about this, that Gamal might succeed his father, because it's not the way the military understands it, is that this is a free officers regime, which began in 1952. It's not a Mubarak dynasty. The military has always been central in Egypt, and this dates back quite a long time, certainly even before 1952. So that's the way I understand it, that what we've seen is a preemptive military coup here. And the notion that it's taken U.S. policymakers by surprise is in itself surprising. The fact that the White House, the administration, has been frustrated or disappointed with the intelligence community is a little bizarre, given that everyone's understood for quite a while that this succession was extremely delicate, that no one knew exactly which way it was going to pan out. And we've been quite worried about this for a while. So obviously this was a concern, and I suspect that that Doug will talk about this a bit. But I mean, the Bush administration, the freedom agenda for, I mean, among many other things, it sort of anticipated that this was an issue with Egypt, that authoritarian regimes were a problem, and that this is one of the upsides of the freedom agenda, to account for these authoritarian regimes and to push for something else. So in other words, the notion that Egypt was a troublesome place and that this succession was going to be a problem, this has been known for quite some time. It should not have taken the administration by surprise, and they should certainly not be blaming the intelligence community for this now, because this debate has been on the table for quite some time. One of the things that I wanted to say, in spite of the fact that I think that we can see this as essentially a preemptive military coup, is there are some victories here for the protesters as well, insofar as we also want to talk about this as a, although I know that Sam is a little, and I think rightly so, skeptical of the overuse of the word a democratic uprising. I think that insofar as there are democratic impulses, I think there are some very positive things that have happened. Namely, I think it is good that Gamal has been taken off the table. I think this is an upside both for Egypt, and also it's an upside for U.S. policy, or it could be an upside for U.S. policy. I think that this is something that people have wanted for quite a while. We've wanted Hosni Mubarak to name a successor, and now there is a vice president, Omar Suleiman. A lot of people might not be happy with it, but this has been a goal, I believe, and again, Doug can speak a little more, or much more fully about this than I can, but I believe that this is something that we've wanted for quite a while. The other victory, of course, is that Hosni Mubarak has agreed to step down. One of the things that needs to be done is he needs to be kept to his word. I don't see, however, to me, I don't see the point in trying to force him off the stage right now. I think he needs to be kept to his word, and I think that what this administration needs to do and what U.S. policymakers need to do is It's going to take difficult work, but if they're really serious about democratic and liberal reform, they're going to need to push Omar Suleiman or whoever succeeds him in elections in September for the same sort of reform that they wanted and that sometimes the Bush administration was good about getting from Mubarak. This is difficult work. It's not easy, and it's not the same thing as shouting from the sidelines for someone to get off the stage. But if U.S. policymakers are serious about democratic Egypt, this is the sort of thing that's going to have to be done. Because as Sam outlined quite well, I think, the liberal trends in Egypt are mighty slim. A lot of people have blamed the Mubarak regime for crushing liberal trends, and there's some truth to that. However, liberal trends have been mighty rare in Egypt certainly since the constitutional era, which ended in about, one way to date that is 1952 with the free officers coup, with Gamal Abdel Nasser's free officers coup. But you can also make an argument that the liberal trends were slim even before then, that starting in about the 1920s, they started to be under attack, most notably from the Muslim Brotherhood. I have to say, I think some of the discussion around the Islamist movement in Egypt is very strange. The notion that somehow the Muslim Brotherhood would not come to power in free and fair elections is slightly counterintuitive, to say the least. I know that one of the explanations that people give is they say, well, the Egyptians have seen what's happened in Tehran and they recognize that this is a profound mistake and they don't want to make the same mistake. Well, we don't exactly know that. The other evidence is frankly compelling, that the Palestinians voted for Hamas, they voted for an Islamic regime, and if we look in Lebanon, 30% of the Christian community, I mean, of all people, we'd hardly expect Christians to want to welcome an Islamist regime. Nonetheless, 30% of the Christian community in Lebanon has aligned itself with the Khomeinist project there through the leadership of General Michel Aoun and his alliance with Hezbollah. So, again, there are plenty of reasons that people opt for Islamist trends in their different countries, and one of the reasons is that many people like Islamist parties. Again, I have to say that it's a slightly counterintuitive notion because the Muslim Brotherhood is perhaps the pillar of Egyptian cultural, political, and intellectual life over the last century. Moreover, it is the flower of Arab political modernity, and this began in Egypt. The notion that it is not going to play a very central role, if not the central role, in the future of Egyptian politics, again, it doesn't make sense to me. This goes back to, if we look at it, this goes back to actually, I say it's tied to Arab political modernity because it started essentially in 1798. The actual founding of the Brotherhood is 1928. But what we see happening in 1798 with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, Muslim intellectuals and activists started to wonder if the Muslim Ummah is the best of all people, as the Prophet of Islam said, then why did it happen that Egyptians were overrun so easily by the infidels? And the answer was different intellectuals started to posit, like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani said the reason for it is because Islam has become weakened. This is one of the reasons why this is the reason why the infidels overran us, non-Muslims overran us so easily. Thanks. Why we were overrun so easily. The idea is that Islam needed a renovation. What it needed to do was purge itself of various non-Islamic excesses and return itself to the practices of the Prophet and his companions and his earliest successors, and these were known as the Salaf, the righteous forebears, and hence this movement is known as the Salafis. And if we look here, it goes from Afghani to Muhammad Abdu, the one-time Mufti of Egypt and the rector of Al-Azhar. Abdu's biographer was a man named Rashid Rida. Rida's chief disciple was Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. So this is a key intellectual trend in Egypt. It plays a very, very important role. It is the intellectual trend in Egypt at this stage. So again, I think this is very, very important to keep in mind when we talk about whether or not the Brotherhood will or will not play a key role. It certainly will. And for U.S. policymakers, I mean, we hear different things coming out of the White House, whether or not how much the administration should push to have the Brotherhood included in a national dialogue and how much it should play a role in the opposition. And this is an important debate. It's an interesting debate because certainly we have to look and say, well, what right do Americans have, what right do American policymakers have to intervene in the decisions of another country? What right do we have to trample on other people's natural rights? And that's certainly a very important argument. The other argument, of course, is it's not the role of the American president to ensure the natural rights of another people. The role of the American president is to protect and preserve American interests, and one key American interest in the Middle East is to preserve peace in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this isn't only for the sake of our ally Israel, but also for the sake right now of our ally Egypt. And this peace treaty undergirds the Pax Americana in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's very, very key U.S. interest. And I think that we have to confront the fact that if there is a Muslim Brotherhood-controlled government in Egypt, that peace treaty is going to be in danger. The Brotherhood has said as much itself, and I think we need to deal with that. If we're going to talk about empowering the Brotherhood and ensuring their role in the national dialogue, we're going to need to face up to the consequences. As Sam was talking about before, looking at some of the protesters, looking at some of the things that were going on, even without the Brotherhood, I think we have to face the fact that we are looking perhaps at a very different Egypt, or an Egypt that is changing. We need to recognize that the people out on the streets, none of them remember the 67 or 73 wars, catastrophic wars for Egypt, and certainly not good for Israel either. There was an interview last Sunday, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and one of the things that he said, and I think this is very key, and Bashar al-Assad said, well, we are not going to, it was partly facetious because, of course, this is an extremely brutal regime, and Syrians understand that if they take to the streets in the numbers that Egyptians do, the Syrian security services will have no reservations about opening fire on Syrian protesters. But something that he said is worth consideration, and this is, we have it a little easier because, or we have it much easier because we don't have a relationship with Israel. And the Egyptians do have a treaty. And whether we like it or not, Sam and I were speaking about before, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to deal with the fact that the region is not happy with that peace treaty. Egyptians, by and large, are not happy with that peace treaty. So this is certainly something to think about down the road, regardless of whether or not, regardless of how much power the Muslim Brotherhood gets. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me onto this panel. In order to avoid undue duplication by the panelists, we've been asked, if possible, to focus on some different aspects from one another. And I've been asked particularly to look at the question of what life might be like for Egyptians and perhaps others if the Muslim Brotherhood achieves a large measure of power in Egypt. What would it mean for political and religious dissidents, Muslims whose view of the nature of politics and the nature of Islam is different from that of the Muslim Brotherhood? What would it mean for Egypt's Coptic Christian minority, the largest non-Muslim minority in the Middle East? What might it mean about the status of women, and so forth? The answers to these questions, or at least suggested thoughts on these questions, depends obviously on two things: what we think is likely to be the strength of the Muslim Brotherhood, and what it is likely to do if it has power. And this is, of course, the strength and intention of the Muslim Brotherhood is perhaps the major subject of debate in the US as it looks at Egyptian politics. One of three things: the question of Mubarak, the question of the military, and the question of the Brotherhood. And the US administration seems to have been going back and forth on each of these over the last few weeks as it tries to sort out their relative strength. But it is significant that we discuss the Brotherhood more than all the other political opposition groups combined. Most news commentators would probably have difficulty listing any of the several dozen other Egyptian opposition groups. There's a very good reason for this. The fact that there are several dozen of them, they're very small, they are very disorganized, and at the moment not in a position to exercise much power, even if it were handed to them. So there is this focus on the Brotherhood as the major actor other than Mubarak and the military within Egypt. What does the Brotherhood believe? I'll give just one quotation and then qualify it. If you go to the Brotherhood's website, you'll find many quotes outlining their goal. I could repeat these at length, probably many of you could as well, but just one. Our goal is to establish one Islamic state of united Islamic countries. One nation under one leadership, whose mission will be to reinforce adherence to the law of God and the strengthening of the Islamic presence in the world arena. The goal is the establishment of a world Islamic state. One could repeat those quotations, and of course, as you would know, you could repeat many other quotations, particularly from political platforms. The platform promulgated in 2007, withdrawn and then re-promulgated, and saying, well, actually we don't mean these things, or that's a very long-term goal. In the short term, we want something else. And amongst the Brotherhood statements in the last several weeks have been saying, this is not an Islamic uprising. This is a democratic uprising. We are, at the moment, the Egyptian Brotherhood, not the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Brotherhood is famously equivocal and contradictory in what it says about itself. I think partly because it is at least tactically quite clever in such matters. But also, apart from the question of what does the Brotherhood actually believe, or what does it intend, we should also bear in mind that what the Brotherhood might do and what it intends to do are, again, not the same thing. This is true for any political goal. If statements about democracy, and we need to understand what that might mean, or statements about religious freedom, these may well be sincerely meant. But if the party acts in such a way, if it believes the laws it passes, if it believes that the versions of Islamic law it wants to enforce will lead to such freedom and democracy, it is mistaken. So even what the Brotherhood might sincerely say about itself might not give us too much indication of what might happen. So what I'd like to do as a means of investigating possible outcomes of Brotherhood's power is to look at two sources. One is to look at how Egypt's religious minorities, which 99% of those minorities are Christians, how they view the current situation. I'll just give you quotations from three church leaders. I do so not because these church leaders would necessarily be founts of political wisdom, but they are highly adept at reading how Egyptian politics might affect them. They're a minority, they're a persecuted minority, and so they look at the situation with a very careful and jaundiced eye. So let me quote one of the leading Roman Catholic figures in Egypt, Issam Bishara, Vice President of the Pontifical Mission Activities in Egypt. He says, though some of the primary opposition leaders in this revolt appear to be modern secular reformers, Church leaders believe the main engine fueling and organizing the demonstrators is the Muslim Brotherhood. Coptic Christians, as well as Egypt's Armenian, Greek Orthodox, Latin, Maronite, and Melkite Greek Catholics, all now fear a fate similar to that of Iraq's Christians. A power vacuum in that country left its minorities marginalized and exposed to the terror of Islamic extremists and criminals. The head of the largest church grouping in Egypt, the Church of St. Mark, usually called the Coptic Orthodox Church, its head, Pope Shenouda III, on national television addressed remarks to Mubarak and said to him, he says, "I called the president and I told him, we are all with you. All the people are with you." And this expression of support for a leader very definitely on the outs is quite striking and shows fear of alternatives to Mubarak. One more, the head of the Anglican Church in Egypt, with reference to Mubarak, "We want to be gracious to a man who served Egypt for 30 years. He had his mistakes just as other leaders." So it's striking that the major spokespeople for religious minorities, while for many years have been complaining about their situation in Egypt, at the moment seem to think that the present situation, while it could be improved, that changes are more likely to be for the worse than for the better. So I take that to be significant. Another way of working out what might happen in Egypt with Brotherhood power would be to look at the example from some other countries. Obviously, this is always dangerous. Each country is unique. The patterns are very, very different. But I think we can learn something. One thing which, of course, has become a Washington sport is to compare and contrast Egypt and Iran. Let us compare 2011 to 1979. Of course, Iran is Shiite, Egypt is Sunni, and each of those regimes has a penchant for imprisoning those people of the wrong sect. Shiites go in for charismatic leaders, Sunnis generally do not. And so people say, well, the differences with Iran are too great for comparison point to be useful. But there are other examples. In fact, Egypt has borders with two territories actually run by offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood. One of these, of course, is Gaza. Hamas is an offshoot of the Brotherhood. Following its electoral victory in Gaza, amongst other things it did, Hamas killed off a large number of its Palestinian Authority opponents. Or to look further south, the National Islamic Front. Sudan is largely a military dictatorship, but its official sponsoring party is still the National Islamic Front. Its previous name was the Muslim Brotherhood within Sudan. It was the first takeover of a country by an Islamist group after the Iranian Revolution. In 1983, the NIF, already represented in parliament, though as a minority party, took over the country and declared that Sudan would be ruled by Sharia. This was in 1983. And Sudan did all of those things which were often told are only the fevered imagining of what an Islamist regime would do. In the first year in one province alone, it carried out 52 public amputations, 12 of them cross-limb, that is, taking an arm and a leg from opposite sides of the body. Public floggings broadcast daily on national television, with and also the broadcast of public hangings, followed by crucifixion, and engaged in 2 wars of genocide against the South and also in Darfur. Currently, as South Sudan has voted to secede, Bashir has said that now in the future for the North, he will change the constitution and impose Sharia law. Sudan is not Egypt. I would actually not expect those things to happen in Egypt. But it does give an example next door of a Muslim Brotherhood sponsored regime. That should give us pause. Or if we look for Islamist regimes or very strong founts of conservative political Islam or revolutionary political Islam, apart from Gaza, apart from Sudan, one might look to Taliban rule in both Afghanistan and in Pakistan within the tribal areas, or portions of Nigeria where tens of thousands of people have died in conflict around the introduction of Sharia in several of the northern states, or the activities of the Al-Shabaab in the areas it controls within Somalia. Again, I emphasize there is no guarantee that the Egyptian Brotherhood would end up exactly like these. But these are the examples, and with Saudi Arabia and Iran are the only other examples we have of regimes which have sought to implement the sort of program which exists on the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood's website. And I'm often tempted to say, what is that definition of insanity? Repeating the same action and expecting a different result. So I would expect Egypt would tend to go in that direction, though in a milder form. The territories I've just very rapidly described share 7 characteristics, or most of them do. Firstly, Muslim voices other than those of the Islamists have been silenced. Secondly, religious and ethnic minorities are persecuted. Women are subjugated. The society tends to be less free than it was before, not that any of these societies was marvelous beforehand. All suffer widespread violence, and most of them have engaged in war. And then finally, the regimes have not moderated while in power. So this, I believe, should give us grave caution and real fear about what might happen within Egypt and outside of it if the Brotherhood had real power. One of our goals should therefore be, as much as we can, which is probably not necessarily that much, to ensure that the future power of the Muslim Brotherhood is limited. To such an end, if it would help if in our conversations about Egypt, or indeed anywhere else, we talked about free and open societies rather than democracy. Democracy has many meanings. One of them is, in German, the Rechtsstaat, implies you respect rights and freedom and things like that. In many other usages, it just means one is able to vote for a government. But what we're concerned about is societies which are democratic and free, not democratic and totalitarian. So we want to stress freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of association, the importance of societal counterweights to the state, the legitimation of opposition, a constitutional order with separation of powers, and a rights regime. These are the particular things we're looking for, and we'll need to refer to them as a shorthand, but I think free societies rather than democratic societies would be a better shorthand. And to the degree we can, we should push for a real transition to such a society, which means giving time for societal forces other than the Muslim Brotherhood to grow, since they were more successfully repressed by Mubarak. I also think that organic change in societies has usually been more effective in producing lasting freedom. There are exceptions. The United States is one. But most of what we've called democracy and free societies has come from the gradual leaching or the spreading of power away from a strong executive to the legislative with a strong judiciary. I think we, as much as we can, we should encourage such a model within Egypt, and I believe that Doug Feith will tell us exactly how to do it. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Paul has set me up to disappoint you. What I'd like to do is not give a policy prescription so much as to give a few of the kinds of considerations that I think either are or should be in the minds of policymakers in the U.S. government. And I want to emphasize the importance of balancing conflicting interests. Very often in these kinds of discussions, people will focus on a particular aspect of the problem. And what policymakers have to do in the government is look at the range of problems and interests that confront them. They don't have the luxury of picking a favorite topic and focusing only on that. So in the national security field, it's beneficial to have a strategy, something that reflects careful consideration of long-term interests and something that sets major national goals. And the value of having a strategy is that it does give, it does bring careful thought to a subject, and it allows a government to chart a course for a sustained period of time and not be buffeted by the shifting winds day to day. I mean, what we have seen in Egypt fairly clearly is that the Obama administration did not have a strategy to deal with Middle Eastern political instability and democracy promotion. It basically had run away from the Bush administration's democracy promotion policies known as the Freedom Agenda. This led, this desire to run away, to distance themselves from anything associated with President Bush, led to the very cold response of the president and his administration to the demonstrators in Iran back in June of 2009. And I think that that became an embarrassment even for people within the administration. They recognized that even many of their own supporters were surprised and unhappy with the president showing no interest in the pro-democratic rhetoric and the bravery of the Iranian demonstrators. Interestingly enough, at the very beginning of this Egyptian political turmoil, once again the administration, indulging a predisposition to de-emphasize democracy, announced in words from the Secretary of State and the Vice President that the Egyptian government was stable. And then they quickly had to maneuver to try to get on the right side of history and say that they actually do have some sympathy with the complaints of the demonstrators against the Mubarak regime. But what we saw was this kind of flipping and flopping, and they've done some more flipping and flopping since. What that really reflects is that there's no broader conceptual context, there's no strategy that what the administration is doing fits into. Now, officials interested in developing a strategy would have to start by clarifying some points, I believe, about democracy promotion or the promotion of liberal democratic ideas and U.S. national security policy. And I'll offer a few thoughts that they might want to consider. One, the U.S. has practical interests in the spread of democratic institutions and the development of democratic institutions. The contrary view, the so-called realist view, which tends to equate authoritarianism with stability, is being refuted in the streets of Tunis and Cairo now. And I think that's one of the important lessons to see, that the view that tends to deprecate the practical importance of democracy is not a view, according to polls, that has much resonance with the American people, but it's important for the American people to understand that in their key national security institutions within the government, the State Department and the CIA, the so-called realist view is the predominant view. And there tends to be a general downplaying of the importance of the practical importance of democracy promotion to the United States. Now, promoting democracy has obvious moral, and I would say less obvious practical benefits. It can help create a more peaceful and stable world. And just to illustrate the point, compare Europe today to Europe at the start of the 20th century, and you could begin to see the benefits, the practical benefits of successful democracy promotion. It can also help diminish the ideological appeal of Islamism. Democracy is not a cure-all for that problem, but it can be important. The second point I would make is that democracy promotion is not a simple matter of overthrowing authoritarian regimes and quickly organizing elections. I think that all of my colleagues on the panel here have issued very important and intelligent warnings, cautions about simplistic approaches to democracy promotion. The term democracy, as Paul Marshall and others have mentioned, is shorthand for a set of liberal democratic concepts, attitudes, and institutions. Concepts such as individual rights, limited government, and rule of law. Attitudes such as compromise, respect for contrary views, and institutions such as multiple power centers, independent judiciary, as was just mentioned, property rights. And so when we talk about promoting democracy, many people think that all we're talking about is rushing to organize elections. And I think it's extremely important. It's part of the problem with using this kind of shorthand. It's extremely important to understand that sensible people who are talking about promoting democracy are talking about promoting these concepts, attitudes, and institutions, and not just looking at the one institution that gets first and foremost attention by most people, which is elections. Now, free and fair elections are an element of democracy, but in the absence of the other elements, they're not only insufficient to create democracy, they can produce anti-democratic results. Democracy is not only about process, but also principles. And so it's not hypocrisy for supporters of democracy to oppose the use of democratic processes to give power to people who reject democratic principles. Nazis, communists, and Islamists have all, in various places and at various times, used democratic means to pursue power, even though they reject liberal democracy in principle. And this is one of the great challenges for liberal democracies. They have to understand that not every element of liberal democracy is a good thing to rush forward with in societies where the use, for example, of quick elections can produce results that are deeply philosophically hostile to the principles of liberal democracy. Now, the third point I would make is, as important as democracy promotion is for U.S. national security policy, it doesn't always trump every other policy consideration. Officials with broad responsibilities are continually forced to make trade-offs among important interests. Now, what that means is that serious policymaking in this area requires arguing against the so-called realist view that democracy promotion is essentially irrelevant to American interests, and also fighting against the purists who argue that anything that is that seems to be at odds with the immediate promotion of democracy and the rushing toward elections is a violation of principle. Fourth, an intelligent, sustained effort to promote democratic institutions should heed the philosopher Edmund Burke's warnings against trying to impose abstract ideas on foreign cultures. Democracy is not a single thing. And Sam Tadros, I think, did a very good job of explaining, from the point of view of an Egyptian who cares about liberal democracy and would like to promote it, is entirely in favor of it, but is properly skeptical about how fast one can move on this track in a country like Egypt. He understands that democracy won't look the same in every country. And Americans need to understand that. Not every country is ready for all the main liberal democratic institutions right away. And some institutions that would be deemed undemocratic in one country may be the key to successful liberal self-government in another. For example, to create and secure democracy, Germany after World War II banned the Nazi and Communist parties. Now, that kind of sweeping ban of political parties would not fly in the United States, but it was deemed important and beneficial and democratic in Germany. And so I think that for people who do see the practical benefit of democracy promotion for the United States, it's important that they develop a sophisticated understanding of the complexities here and the fact that, as I said, democracy is not going to look the same, and it's not going to have all the same institutions in every country. But that's not an argument for dismissing either the moral or the practical benefits to the United States of trying to encourage the development of liberal democratic institutions. Now, U.S. policymakers are now being forced to consider what our key interests are in Egypt. And I think the list is fairly obvious to most everybody. I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. We have an interest in regional peace. We have an interest in the considerations of trade and prosperity for the region, in counterterrorism, in countering the spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the area. And that's, of course, a reference to regional state-to-state relations vis-a-vis Iran, for example, and we have an interest in making sure that we don't wind up at the end of this political upheaval, for example, with an Egyptian government that decides it wants to pursue its own nuclear weapons program. And we have this very strong interest in political reform in Egypt and in the broader Arab and Muslim worlds. The United States, as I said, has a large stake in this, and our strategic interest is to promote the kinds of liberal democratic concepts and institutions that I just mentioned, but to do so with caution and common sense and without illusions of the type that Sam Tadros warned against, about overnight transformations in the attitudes and principles of millions of people. A key here is being clear-eyed about the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a philosophical enemy of liberal democratic ideas. And I think that Paul Marshall has done a very good job in his brief presentation in warning about the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that Lee Smith's remarks and Paul's should be taken to heart by everybody in the U.S. government foreign policy establishment as they view the Muslim Brotherhood. Again, as I said, the realist view that predominates in the U.S. government tends to deprecate the importance of ideas as such, or ideology, in world affairs. I think that's a very big mistake. Because in dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood, you're not just talking about a set of practical interests, you're dealing with a group that form on the basis of an ideology and lives to serve that ideology. And as practical and flexible and nimble as they've shown themselves to be in many respects, I think it would be a serious mistake to ignore the essential ideological nature of the organization and to just assume that they're that they can easily become responsible political actors in a democratic Egypt. Now, the reason there's so much focus on the Muslim Brotherhood is that they are one of the two main institutions that that are right now maneuvering for influence and power in whatever the next stage of Egyptian political development is going to be. America's job is to do what it can to help manage or influence the political transition in Egypt, but it's important to observe that in all events our influence is limited in this kind of an affair, and it's especially limited given that we entered into all of this turmoil as the United States government with no strategy. And I think that the fact that we did not, over the last 2 years, have an administration that was reaching out to multiple players in Egypt and cultivating people and institutions and ideas that could have helped us with better information, better intelligence, better contacts, more influence, has put us in a position where the United States government now is largely a bystander rather than a significant player in developments in Egypt. But in any event, we should be trying within our limited means to exercise some influence, and that influence, if we have a truly strategic view that takes into account these considerations about promoting liberal democratic institutions and recognizing who the Muslim Brotherhood is, should be whatever influence we have should be directed toward minimizing the kind of political power that the Muslim Brotherhood would like to establish for itself in Egypt. And I would just say that overall, my message is a message of trying to approach this problem with balance and to recognize that what the administration has been doing in recent days has been crisis management rather than the implementation of a strategy. And it would be helpful if they had a strategy. It makes the crisis management in many ways easier and more likely to advance the U.S. national interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think our panelists did an excellent job of illuminating some of the issues that our policymakers are thinking about and talking about today, or should be. We are now going to go to our questions. I ask that before you ask a question that you identify yourself and your organization, and to wait for the microphone. Since we are taping this, it will be on our website at www.hudson.org. Over on this side, the first lady.
Thank you. I'd like to direct this question to Douglas Feith and whoever else might have some insight into it. But I want to know what your thoughts are. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Indira Lakshmanan. I'm the diplomatic correspondent for Bloomberg News. And I wanted to ask your perspective on the Obama administration having cut funding for democracy projects in Egypt over the last few years. And just looking at the budget, the military funding remained the same. The democracy funding was cut. and more money was given to agricultural and other programs. And tell us why you think they did this, and whether you think this has had an effect on disempowering NGOs or pro-democracy groups. Thanks.
I think that the cutting of funds by the Obama administration for democracy promotion was one aspect of what I referred to in my talk as their turning away or running away from the Bush freedom agenda. And it's an interesting point, I think, to realize that the general promotion of liberal democratic ideas and institutions has been a part of American national security policy from Democratic and Republican administrations for decades. And President Bush made it a particularly highly illuminated part of his policy, but it was not a radical departure from American foreign policy. What was much more of a radical departure from traditional American foreign policy was what the Obama administration did when it came in cutting aid, cutting democracy promotion funds, and basically showing a lack of interest, an affirmative lack of interest in democracy in Russia, or human rights and democratic considerations in Russia, in China, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, and various other places where it had been an important part of the American agenda. The Obama administration, and then of course in President Obama's Cairo speech, he talked about democracy there, but he gave it so clearly a minor emphasis that it was in real contrast to what had been done by the previous administration. And I think it was largely an effort for Obama to position himself as the un-Bush, and I think it was a very serious mistake. And I do think it did harm, as your question suggests, it did harm our ties to various groups and our ability basically to have better information and better contacts in Egypt during this crisis.
Okay. Gentleman right here.
My name is Cami Bhatt. I write for the Pakistani Spectator. My question is that to Mr. Doug Feith, how come Obama administration didn't know about this? We spend billion and trillion of dollars on intelligence, and it's like it's a drama. And my question is that, do you think Obama would use this Egyptian crisis asking Israel to give some more concession, otherwise he would be more prone to support the democratic movement in Egypt? And the second thing about this sham democracy, like Lee Smith talked, this is not the first time. I'm from Pakistan, and as you can imagine, the minority are not protected with the coming of democracy. Mr. 10% even couldn't save his governor, who was the ruling very important province in Pakistan, Punjab. He couldn't save him. So, if these countries are not ready for democracy, then why do we push this agenda on that? But on the other hand, people say somehow, since I'm Muslim, so I could say that these people are inherently less cultured and they do not deserve democracy. If we derive the result of today's debate, somehow those impressions can come very obvious. So my question is, how Obama could use this crisis as a leverage against Israel, because it was very difficult to budge Bibi Netanyahu to give some concession on this crisis to Palestinians. But now Obama is in a very strong position to do that. Thanks.
Well, I think one of the noteworthy features about the political upheaval in Egypt is how little it has to do with Israel, and so I don't think that that Israel is a gigantic factor here. Your point about intelligence, very often our intelligence can produce some insight about particular facts. But the kind of question about which the administration was surprised, which is that this authoritarian regime in Egypt was going to have a major, was going to create major instability when the time came for dealing with some kind of political transition. You didn't have to be an intelligence official to see that coming. I mean, anybody. I mean, that's a matter of intelligence, but it's the intelligence of ordinary people we're talking about. It's not the intelligence of intelligence agencies. There was a lack of intelligence in the sense that they failed to see something that should have been obvious to everybody, when I say failed to see, perhaps in part of their brains, the leaders of the U.S. government saw this, but it was not at the fore of their minds, and they were not dealing with it as something that could happen imminently, and that's part of the reason they looked so shocked and at sea when the events occurred. The other point I would make is, again, since I'm trying to show how important it is to balance interests here, when people say that some countries or some people are not ready for democracy, sometimes that's true. And I think, we've seen examples of it where people have democratic opportunities and they blow them. And you get an example, I mean, like the elections in the Gaza Strip that produced this extremely anti-democratic result of putting Hamas in power. But just as a countervailing thought, if you had said to a serious student of Germany, let's say, in 1946, that in 60 or 65 years, Germany was going to be a solid liberal democracy whose basic attitude toward international affairs was pacifist, they would have said, you don't know anything about German history, German culture. It ain't gonna happen. And all the sensible, realistic people would have said that democracy of that kind in Germany was inconceivable. Likewise, Japan. And so I think that as important and I do think valid as all the cautions, the warnings that we've heard from our panel are this morning, and about the difficulties of moving a society like Egypt in the direction of liberal democracy, as important as that is, I don't think we should be completely closed-minded to the idea that countries sometimes manage to pull off philosophical sea changes that are very beneficial to the people in that country and beneficial to the world. And so it's in America's interest to promote those ideas even when they are long shots, because in some cases they pay off, as in Germany, in the case of Germany and Japan, I mean, they pay off enormously for those countries and for the world and for U.S. interests.
Okay, there was a question in the back of the room, woman right there.
Hello, my name is Kaho Aizomitani from NHK Japanese Television. My question
Could you
goes
speak up a little bit, please?
Into mic. Okay. My name is Kaho Aizomitani from NHK Japanese Television. My question goes to Mr. Fight and any other person at the panel. Under the current turmoil, do you think ultimately the U.S. has a path or a way to preserve the peace treaty? By buying time for the election, do you think the U.S. knows who to speak to stop the current tide of the Muslim Brotherhood expanding their power?
as I said before, I don't think we know as much as we should know, and I think that the whole U.S. government would benefit enormously if key officials took the time to hear the presentations that Sam Tadros and Lee Smith and Paul Marshall made this morning about the political scene there.
Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sam described before when he was looking at the protests. I agree with Doug when he says that one of the interesting things about this protest, and also if we look at Tunisia and around the rest of the region, is that we realize that the Arab-Israeli crisis is not the key issue, that there are lots of other issues as well. However, if we also look at these demonstrations, I think that one of the things that we see is that people are dissatisfied, people are unhappy with the peace treaty. If we're talking about giving people a free voice in the governance of their own societies, one of the things we're going to find out is that for better or worse, people do not like this peace treaty with Israel. I find it very unfortunate, but I think it's the case. And if we look around the region, that's the way it is. And we can blame the regimes as much as we want for stirring up anti-Semitic discourse, anti-Israel discourse, and they certainly do a perfectly good job of this. But it is also a popular feeling on the street. And so even if it's not for the Muslim Brotherhood, I think that one of the things that we probably need to come to terms with pretty soon is that the peace treaty may be on shaky grounds. I don't think with the military regime, but also we need to understand that this is what the military games for, war with Israel. This is what it plans for. That's the enemy, not Libya, not Sudan, not the Iranians, Israel. So I think it's an enormous issue. And we can't dismiss this stuff as easily as people want to, saying, well, we really have the military over a barrel, or no one wants to go back and fight. Again, we're talking about tens of millions of young people who do not remember 67 or 73 and the catastrophe that brought Egypt.
A question right here.
My name is Ron Parlato, retired international development consultant. The question I have is that while I appreciate the need for a maturity or a maturation process for civil society so that the institutions of democracy are strong, what seems to be is that there will be an election in September. And the scenario there, according to what you have said and what we read, is that the Muslim Brotherhood is likely to be in power. If that's the case, the U.S., if they follow what they did in Gaza, is to not recognize Hamas and not recognize the Muslim Brotherhood, which will cause the street to erupt again, more than likely. And you know, we're in worse trouble. So what I'd like just to hear is your perspective for the future. What's going to happen if there are elections in the fall? Or do you suspect that there won't be? And what is the result of that? Thank you.
Sam, you want to?
Yeah. I think there will definitely be elections in the fall. How those elections, of course, we're speaking about presidential elections and not parliamentary ones, because the Egyptian government has so far refused to dissolve the Egyptian parliament, arguing that to pass those constitutional amendments, you have to have the current parliament. So presidential elections will take place. I would doubt that the Muslim Brotherhood would be able to challenge the military in the presidential elections. The Egyptian military is immensely popular. The reasons are various points. The popularity out of a victory with Israel in 1973, the army viewed as clean. We never hear about any corruption cases inside the army being viewed as efficient. So if the army puts young face, perhaps I would say the prime minister being the interesting candidate here. Of course, when I say young face, that's relative. He's 69, I believe.
That's young.
so younger than Omar Suleiman, the vice president, I mean. I think in that case, he'd be able to win the presidential elections. I doubt the concern today is with the presidential election specifically. The more important question would be with the parliamentary elections. I think the pressure would be on the regime immediately after the presidential elections to then dissolve parliament and call for new elections, since everyone knows what disgrace of an elections the last one was. In that case, I think the victory of the Muslim Brotherhood is an issue to be concerned with. Of course, there are many issues to deal with here. All politics are local. We're not talking about winning Egypt as a whole, what would happen in each district, who are the candidates there. There are so many different issues to deal with. But I think the real fear would be with the Muslim Brotherhood in the parliamentary elections and not in the immediate presidential elections, where the Brotherhood would unlikely have a serious candidate to challenge a young, clean face from the military.
I would like to pose a question to our panelists. We, the United States, for decades now, have been giving Egypt $1.5 to $2 billion annually in aid. Is that leverage we can use now, looking prospectively, to now that Mubarak will be out of the way, to bring in some of these democratic values and institutions that Doug talked about? And if so, what would you think, what would you call priorities and achievable priorities in the near term? Sam, do you want to start with that?
I think one of the interesting surprises in the last few days is how less information we have about the Egyptian military. I've spoken to various people in the administration, previous administration, and the sense is that Mubarak had always kept a wall of separation between the Egyptian military and its American contacts. That any attempts to deal with the military, to open a channel directly with the military leadership, was always stopped by Mubarak. So whether the military contact, the aid, reflects any real relationship with the people inside or not, I think is a question mark. Whether it can be used, definitely. I think everyone has been talking about the aid to Egypt in the form of a stick. I think that's a reasonable way of talking about it, about cutting the aid to get the results that you want. I think it might also be worthwhile to think for a while about whether the aid can be used as a carrot. Whether more aid, perhaps, various forms of more aid, more help, might be a way of encouraging the military to bring reforms that are badly needed. What those reforms would be, I would say that it's more important than opening up the system, is allowing the ideas that we understand as liberal and democratic to be inside that system. The Egyptian government has always managed to portray the problem, and rightly so, of choosing between a regime and the Islamists. How you'd be able to create an alternative and allow this alternative to grow, of bringing those ideas inside Egyptian society, of allowing real civil society to grow. I think those are the areas where the military would be pressured to bring those changes.
Paul, would you like to say something? You've painted a very dire picture based on the comments of the Christian leaders. This is the largest religious minority in the Middle East, the Coptic Christians of Egypt. If they've drawn comparisons with Iraq, which is certainly chilling. Half the Christians there have left since 2004. If there's a mass exodus of 10 million or so people, it will be bad for U.S. interests. What do you see that the United States should be thinking about and doing at this point?
Okay, in terms of the sort of other countries I mentioned, again, they're going to be different from Egypt. But just to emphasize my basic point, that all of the examples are horrible regimes, so we should not expect anything different in Egypt. In terms of dealing with religious minorities in Egypt, I believe that one of the things the U.S. should push is for religious freedom, and in this context important because in this context a major part is equality before the law. That is one thing cops have pushed for, a fairly simple demand, a uniform code for building places of worship. The rules governing building a church should be the same as building a mosque, very similar. Other features of those demands are that essentially rights are based upon citizenship rather than religion. So these are not so much only protections for a particular group, but universalizing the law and having a citizenship law. And I would tie this as part of the agenda of the use of U.S. aid. We mentioned before the cutting back on democratization programs in Egypt. I think one thing that the U.S. can certainly use its military aid to leverage is the ability to offer more aid, which goes towards the question of civil society. That includes religious freedom and other forms of human rights, the growth of independent journalism, of a free press, and things of this kind. I think this we can do. It would help Egyptians, and it also provides a foundation for the growth of alternate voices and alternative political parties. So I'd use our aid to leverage more aid and make religious freedom a part of that.
Well, thank you. I think we're out of time now, and I want to ask you all to join me in thanking our presenters today.